Type 1 and Type 2 context-based questions can really throw people off sometimes. So what I want to do is go through how you can reason your way through one of these and interpret the context of a hypothesis test and the different types of errors that could happen. So we're looking at, for this example, we're looking at an ESP test where a subject has to view the back of cards and they identify whether it's a circle, square, star, or cross. There are 4 possibilities. They have to guess what it could be. Now, if the proportion, P is the proportion of correct answers. So what we have here is our null would be that they should be getting about 25% of them correct because there are 4 possibilities. So, you'd expect that. However, you wouldn't expect them to be getting more than 25% of them correct. It would, if they were, then that might mean, hey, they might have ESP. And they even say that here in the context of the question. The subject is recognized to have ESP when the null hypothesis is rejected. What would a type 2 error result in? So here's what I want to deal with first. Now it's telling me that the subject is recognized to have ESP when the null hypothesis is rejected. So I'm going to fill in this little chart I have down here. Now you'll notice I have the null being true and the null being false. And then I have a separate column or row here for rejecting. You notice I have a type 1 error. That's when you reject the null when the null is true. That's why it ends up right over here. And then I have failing to reject the null when you should, which is your type 2, which I have down here. So now if the null is true, that means person doesn't have ESP. I'm going to use a lighter pen here, but it means they don't have ESP. Okay. I'm just going to put doesn't have ESP. And I can fill that in for both of these here because if the null's true, then it means they don't have ESP. Darn it. Try again, right? Now, if the null is false, then that means, hey, the person has ESP. So I'm going to fill that in right here. So again, this gives me some context to work with. So again, what I just did was I said, okay, if the null is true, then that means the person doesn't have ESP. I said if the null is false, then they have ESP. Now we're going to view it a little bit further now, because now we're going to look at it in the course of rejecting. Okay, so if we reject the null, when the null is true, that's type 1, not type 2. So we go here, right? This means person doesn't have ESP, and null is true, and it says we reject it. So if we're rejecting that null, we're concluding they do. They don't have ESP, but if we reject the null, then we say, hey, there's evidence that they might have ESP, but they don't. Now over here, if I reject my null, again, I'm saying they have ESP, they have it. We find they do. That's good. We want that. Conclude they do. That's great. Now if we fail to reject the null, then that means we haven't necessarily proven they have ESP, but we say there's not evidence to prove that they don't have ESP. You know what I mean? Because we have our null hypothesis here where we say that, okay, they don't have ESP. We don't have enough evidence to disprove that. We're not necessarily proving it's true, we just don't have enough evidence to disprove that. So we're going to say no evidence to conclude otherwise. I'm going to put that in both of these. Or I'll just say no evidence to conclude they do. That's the way I should. Instead of otherwise, I'm going to change that to they do. That might help us a bit with our context here. All right, so filling in this chart, it can help me when I have a question like this, when I have to interpret stuff. Because now it's asking me, subject is recognized to have ESP. Okay, what would a type 2 error result in? So if I look down for my type 2 error, what that means is I failed to reject the null when I should be doing that. So it says, in this case, it would be the person having ESP, but we don't have the evidence to conclude that they do. So I can look here and say, okay, currently recognizing it, we didn't end up doing that. Mistakenly thinking someone has ESP, we didn't do that. Not recognizing someone really has ESP. It looks like we said here they have it. We don't have the evidence to conclude that they do. So looks like that's what we're doing here, but let's keep going. Correctly realizing someone doesn't have ESP. Hey, that looks like when we fail to reject the null, and that's good. We want that. That would be right here for part C, or part D, excuse me. Failing to understand the nature of ESP, we can eliminate that. And I'm even going to go back here, correctly realizing someone has ESP. Right here, we can find that here. They have ESP, we conclude they do. B, mistakenly thinking they have ESP, that would be right here. That would be a type 1 error. Doesn't have ESP, but we conclude they do. So filling in a chart like this can help you answer a question like this. So again, you got fail to reject, you got reject, you got your null being true and your null being false. So what I did was I started out with the null being true. It means they don't have ESP. Filled that in. False means they have ESP. I filled that in. You'll notice in each of these columns here. And then rejecting, it means we conclude they have ESP. Notice I filled that in for both of these. Failing to reject, no evidence to conclude they do have ESP. I filled that in for both here. By filling this in, it gave me an opportunity to see the context and how it might result in a type 1 or a type 2 error, just like here. It can be a bit helpful if you have a little trouble with the logic and the concepts of it. Hopefully this helps.